Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Wheeler Centre. My name is Santilla Chingaipe. I'm a journalist and a documentary filmmaker. Tonight we're going to be talking about sexually transmitted debt. And I've got a few panellists that will help me sort of dissect and unpack this very, very important issue. We will be taking questions from the audience towards the end of the panel, so if you do have any questions, feel free to put your hands up and someone will come to you with a microphone. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet this evening, the Wurundjeri people, and pay my respects to their elders, both past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge any elders that might be present with us this evening. Okay, so sexually transmitted debt. To help me sort of discuss this, to my immediate left is Larke Riemer, and she's been a director with Care Australia since 2015. Until recently, she was the director of the Women's Markets for Westpac Banking Corporation. She spent over 31 years with the Westpac Group and is a regular commentator in the media on issues relating to women and the female economy, and has been awarded a Lifetime Recognition Award for her outstanding contribution to women and banking. She was a preliminary judge of the Australian Financial Review and Westpac 100 Women of Influence Awards. She's the current chair and global ambassador of the Global Banking Alliance for Women in Banking, with previous board involvement with Diversity Board, Allen, Linklater and NBCF Advisory Board. Please make Larke feel very welcome. And sitting next to Larke is Christine Craik, and she's a social worker working mainly in health and crisis work with women and children dealing with family violence and or child sexual abuse. She's worked for 12 years in the response team at the Alfred Hospital, working with families of trauma patients. Christine lectures in the social work undergraduate and postgraduate programs at RMIT University and teaches the Working with Violence and Abuse subject. She's currently the National Vice President of the Australian Association of Social Workers and has been on the board of the Australian Association of Social Workers since 2011. She's also the chair of Project Respect, an organisation that works to support women and girls who work in or have been trafficked into sex work. Please make Christine feel very welcome. And last but not least, Donna Letchford is a financial counsellor at the Women's Legal Service of Victoria, working with women who are dealing with family violence and predominantly economic abuse. She became a financial counsellor in 2011 after a career in the banking industry of over 2 decades. In her work at the Women's Legal Service Centre, she's been able to obtain significant outcomes in reducing or waiving family violence clients' debt and play a significant role in assisting women in rebuilding their lives after violence. In 2016, she was awarded the Financial and Consumer Rights Council's Virginia Noonan Award for this work. Please make Donna feel very welcome. So I guess I think I'll begin with you, Donna. I think perhaps we could start with the definition. Sexually transmitted debt, what is it?
Okay, so sexually transmitted debt is debt that you get from the result of a relationship. Now, it can be just a relationship that has gone, that just hasn't worked. It could be that you've taken out the debt together and it's just been at the end of it, a business may have failed, somebody may have died, somebody may have got ill, and you're left with the debt. The worst case of sexually transmitted debt is when economic abuse has been involved as well, which means that it has been a deliberate case of building debt up against you.
And Christine, you've had sort of first-hand experience in this area. What can you tell us about your own experiences?
Well, for myself, it was quite a shock to get out of a relationship, a family violence relationship, and realise as I've reflected on it, there was so much economic abuse in that relationship. So, the sort of the coercive control and the gaslighting and the making you think things that actually wasn't right. It was very, very powerful. So it wasn't really until I got out and had a look at what was going on that I realised it. So I think economic abuse can be quite blatant and you can see it, and I'd certainly work with a lot of women who were, survivors, victims of economic abuse, but I think it can also be really subtle and hard to pick up on, and I think that's when it becomes extremely dangerous as well.
Mm. And Larke, what impact do you think sort of financial literacy has in this area? You know, do you think many women are aware of, finances, managing finances, before they go into relationships or whilst they're in relationships?
No, I don't believe so. As you said in my introduction, I've been 32 years with Westpac, so my experience with a lot of women, and my last role, which lasted about 12 years, was working with women, solely with women. So I had lots of examples of women talking to me about the relationships they had and the debt that they got into because of those relationships and how it crippled them, and, you know, second marriages and all sorts of issues. Women who were in their 70s whose husbands had left them and they were left with debt and all sorts of issues. So we decided many years ago in my team that we needed to do seminars and educational programs where we would get women to talk about and understand what the issues were. And I was dumbfounded by the number of women who were getting married or in a relationship and planning to get married who had absolutely never had a conversation about what their partner or their prospective partner had in the way of debt, and the two of them would never discuss that. And inevitably women would say, but I don't want to, because they didn't want to kill the romance, you know. So they thought, I don't want to have a discussion about what debt he has because maybe he won't, you know, it'll cause us a problem and the marriage won't go ahead. So there's an awful lot of issues, and I'm generalising. But today I would say, if all of you in this room thought about when you got married or you were in a relationship, did you ever have a conversation about the debt? And I'd say that there'd be a lot of you in the room who would never have had that conversation.
Donna, I want to go back to your definition of sexually transmitted debt. You said on the extreme end, it's economic abuse.
Yes.
What does it look like in its early manifestations? I mean, what does that behaviour look like when someone is being, you know, financially abusive?
As Christine said, it's probably not a one-size-fits-all. Some of it is very blatant, and it depends what other abuses may be happening as well. So if there's physical abuse already taking place, it may be quite there that sign this contract, I want this, I need you to sign this. And the power and control is such that they will sign it anyway, even knowing that it is wrong, whether some of the information that's been provided to an institution is actually incorrect, just to get the loan. But it's that pressure and control there. Others are more insidious. They may not understand the finances. They may leave it all to the other party and think and get told, oh yeah, everything's all right, everything's going fine and it's all right. And then they're building up debt in the other party's name, in the survivor's name. And it's not until after they get to the end of the relationship that they understand that what the whole amount is that's owing, and then they have no idea how to deal with it. Because you can look at both males and females, but it's going to be overwhelmingly women that are affected by this, because they are the ones who are less likely to earn the money. They may stay home with the children, they may be working part-time. So they're going to be the ones that are more affected at the end of that relationship.
So would I be correct in assuming that at the extreme end is if the partner is the one that's making all the financial decisions, then that is what you would define as economic abuse?
If there is power and control. I guess the question, it's a fine line sometimes between what's a relationship gone bad and what's economic abuse. Sometimes it's really clear, sometimes it's not so clear. But the question you ask at any stage is, could you have asked the question? Could you have asked about the finances? What were going to be the consequences if you asked, or what did you think the consequences are going to be? And if you were fearful of asking anything about the finances, then yes, you're looking at economic abuse.
Yeah. Christine, was that your experience? Did you find yourself in a situation where you did sort of feel fearful to ask about finances and talk about it?
Oh, absolutely. So I didn't even really realise that we were going to have a relationship where there was family violence until I questioned what was going on with the credit cards. And mine was different. I mean, I was in control of the finances at the start. I didn't realise that was going to be part of it. All the utilities were in my name. I was given responsibility for doing all the banking, and then it turned out that I was given all the responsibility, but he was never going to participate in paying for much of that. So that makes it quite difficult. I'd come into the marriage with 4 children from a previous marriage, and he didn't see it at all, even though, you know, I'd sort of negotiated this with him for 7 years. Beforehand, I didn't realise that's what it was going to be like when we got in there. So the first time I mean, I had conversations with him about where is his share of, you know, the electricity bill or his share of the mortgage and things like that. But the first time I found out what was going on with the credit cards and questioned him about it, that was when he flew into a rage. I got punched, threatened with a knife, things like that. And from then on, it really only takes one of those, although there wasn't one of those, but it really only takes one of those for you to be very careful about having conversations that you know will tip someone over into that area. Yeah.
Larke, I'm interested in what you said about women not having these conversations when you held the seminars, and I'm sort of thinking about the conversations that I have with my girlfriends, and we talk about everything in relationships but finances. Why is that? Why aren't we talking about finances?
I sort of have my own example, and I think the two examples that you've been given are the ones which is really an awful situation to be in. But there are a lot of women who think that it's okay, I'm going to be looked after. So the reason I don't need to talk about finances is I'm going to get married, I'm going to have this white knight in, you know, in shining armour who's going to look after me, and I'll be okay. You know, like I started saying many years ago that a man is not a financial plan. So it's about how do women look after themselves and not think that some man is, or whatever man or woman is going to look after you. But I think it goes back to our grandmothers and whatever. You know, we were never taught to have responsibility around those things a lot of the times. And it is very different today. A lot more women are looking after the finances, but there's still an awful lot of women who feel they're trusting and they think, well, you know, I'm at home looking after the children and he's got super and we're all going to be all right. But with the divorce rate so high in this country, you know that it's not going to be all right. And when you think about you saying with your girlfriends, it's true. Would your girlfriends ever know how much they've got in their superannuation? You know, women don't think about retirement planning either. What am I going to do when I stop work? Because you've got to fund at least, 30 years of not working, and the pension's not going to be enough. So I just think sometimes with women, we think everything's going to be okay. We look after everybody else and we put ourselves last. And, as a mother, you make sure that your parents are okay, your kids are okay, and everything else is okay, but you'll be all right because once they're all grown up and everything's okay, then you'll look after you. And half the time that's not the case because you're on your own and your health fails, and that's why we've got so many women now in a homeless situation. So I don't mean to say that women are fabulous and do great things, but I'm just saying I think we need to, education, it's all around education. If you don't have the knowledge and the education around how to manage your funds, how to, when you're in a relationship, the kind of conversations you need to have, and I'm sorry, if you're in a relationship which is volatile, it's easy for someone like me to say, well, if you had the knowledge, you wouldn't be there. That's crazy because you never know what's going to happen. So I just finished, I had the same situation, but mine was dumb on my part. I got in a situation where I left my husband when I was I got married very young at 17 and had my first child at 18 and a second child 10 years later. It took me 10 years to get over it, so I went back for another one. So I left him at 32 because I basically had outgrown my husband. So obviously meeting him at 16, but then I went back and I bought a hotel with him. And I left Westpac for a whole 3 months and put all my money, sold my house, superannuation and everything, and put it into this hotel. And I knew within a week that I'd done the wrong thing. I thought, what was I thinking? Didn't like his cats, didn't like him, didn't like the hotel. There were so many things I didn't like. And do you know, at the time, Westpac, I could go back to my job. I rang up and said, can I come back, please? And they took me straight back. And I walked away from it all and started all over again. Now, I was fortunate that I had a good job to go back to and I could start all over again, but I did the stupidest thing. I should never have done what I did, and no one could tell me because I was in my 40s, which I think when you get in your 40s, you feel like you know everything. So I'm just saying there's different examples is what I'm saying, very different examples. But mine was an example of not really thinking, and I was a banker. I should have known better.
Donna, just listening back to what Christine was talking about in her situation, and violence was also involved. Is that a link that you're finding, that economic abuse and physical violence go together?
Yeah, quite considerably. There's been various surveys come out and saying about 70 or 80% of the women interviewed said who had suffered physical violence also suffered economical violence. However, I think the figure's probably even bigger than that because of people's understanding of what economic abuse is. It really hasn't been clear. People don't know, and a lot of family violence survivors don't realise that they've actually suffered economic abuse. They will just carry on and try and deal with the debts, not realising that they've been coerced or they've done things. They feel, well, I signed the papers, I said yes, this was all okay, I should have questioned it more. It's all of this doubts, this self-confidence and things like that, so they won't question it. They'll just say, okay, it's my fault, I signed it, I've got to wear it.
Christine, is there a distinction that can be made, I guess, in terms of when you are in a relationship and some of the sort of financial sacrifices that you have to make versus when it does become financial abuse? Yeah. I think Larke gave an example of where she put everything into the investment that her partner had wanted. But say you're in a situation where your partner isn't perhaps financially doing as well as you are and needs a bit of help. Where do you start drawing the line? Where do you distinguish between, what is a compromise as part of a relationship versus what is actually, you're being manipulated into a situation that you perhaps don't want to be in?
Well, I think that's the answer, isn't it? It's when you're being manipulated or coerced into a situation where you don't want to be in that situation. So if you're in a relationship and there's a lot of respect, it's an equal relationship, there's toing and froing, and if you're putting money in, that it's going to happen the other way around, that's fine. But if you're in a relationship where you're trying to question what's going on with the money and you're being gaslighted the whole time, that's not right. Where did you get your ideas? Did you grow up watching the Brady Bunch? Did you think things would be equal between us? I didn't think you were so stupid. When those sorts of things are being done over and over and over, and at the same time you're too afraid to say no, you're too afraid not to take all those speeding points on your licence or pay all those parking fines or pay all whatever's going on, there's a huge difference, and there's a difference. It's based in fear, those decisions. Yeah.
Can I ask a question? I'm interested because, because I talked a lot about the fact that an environment that you lived in with your children, that children grow up hearing this kind of violence around finances, around money, and how do they go on to become young adults? Because I thought there's a certain violence around economics with children, isn't there? Because they only hear their mum and dad or fights in the house because it's about money.
Well, they didn't hear fights about money because I was too afraid to have those fights about money. But one of the things this has taught me, and I was very financially literate. I had worked in a bank before I decided to do social work, and I was very financially literate. And I love doing my banking. I love doing my graphs. I love doing all that stuff. I'm in love with the barefoot investor. I do, get into all that. And I've made all my children get the barefoot investor, and we all sit there and talk finances. We talk super. We talk everything. My children are very financially literate because of what that put us in. So I was just reflecting when I was coming here tonight that it was 25 years ago that I sold the house I had and moved in with him with the children, and I'm still not back to the financial position I was 25 years ago. But I took a second job very early on to make sure that those children had what they needed. I wouldn't say they wanted for nothing because, of course, children always want for everything. But they got what they wanted. They got what they needed as they were growing up, because even though he was doing what he was doing, I did have my second job to make sure, makes your hair go grey quite early on. But yeah, I think...
Donna, are there some women that are perhaps more vulnerable to this? I'm sort of thinking if you come from a migrant refugee background and English isn't your first language and you move to Australia and you're not very familiar with how the banking system works here, are women in those situations perhaps a little bit more susceptible to...
There are those barriers where English isn't your first language, and that you are more susceptible. Also cultural things, different cultures have different things on how money should be used and things like that. So they are some barriers there already. But I think you've got to understand that economic abuse doesn't play favourites. It affects all socioeconomic standings. Very educated. As Christine was saying, she was educated, she was financially literate, she was fine. It affects people. It could affect your next door neighbour who may seem everything's going all right and there's issues there. I've dealt with people who live in very, very opulent neighbourhoods, but don't have a stick of furniture in their house because they've just had to deal with it all that way. But yes, I would have to say that people, where there's other barriers on top of it, disability is also another area where there's a lot of abuse happening as well.
Larke, I want to think about, come back to what you were talking about when you finally managed to regain control of your own finances and your future in that sense. What were some of the things that you had to unlearn around that so that you could, I guess, better manage your life? And then I guess when you are in these seminars, what advice do you give women in particular in terms of what they should be thinking about when it comes to managing their finances?
So my concentration is not so much on the violence side, which it's not, but I worked for a bank, so we didn't talk as much around the violence side, even though we did know that it occurred. Mine was around education and trying to get women to understand the knowledge they needed and the participation that they took in the finances. So from my point of view, I knew I'd done a wrong thing. It was rather silly, and I walked away from it all because it was a hotel over in Port Melbourne in the 80s, and I was never going to get any money back because he was struggling and what have you, but I decided I didn't want to put my two girls through arguments and what have you, so I just went back to work and knuckled down and made sure that I worked hard and always went for jobs that paid more money, because I knew I had to get a higher income in order to re-establish myself, which I managed to do, and I retired 2 years ago. So, but it took me 20 years to get back to where I needed to be, but through, again, hard work and what have you. But my big emphasis in my role right up until I left, and even as the Global Banking Alliance chair and working in underdeveloped countries, it is around the knowledge. I think knowledge is power. And so it's trying to teach younger women around having enough money to retire on, or having enough money to make the right decisions in their life. And I jokingly said, but I've been using this for many, many years, that a man is not a financial planner. And it's trying to say to women, don't make decisions around the kind of partner you're going to get married to or the person in your life. It's around, well, how am I? Am I self-sufficient? Am I, have I got enough money to look after me? And then if I meet somebody that I love, then that's icing on the cake, but you still need to have those right conversations. I talked about having my two daughters. They're now 37 and 47, and neither of them are married, so I've brought them up to be very independent and very focused on their finances, but I've messed it up for me because I've got no grandchildren. But I've got grandpuppies. So it's around knowledge. I still think it's knowledge, and so many young women today think, I'm going to get... we did classes in schools. We went and I'd say to a whole lot of girls in private schools, put your hand up if you think you're going to be looked after when you get older, and they all put their hands up. So, it's still a case of this whole thing that if you're in a family where you seem in a successful family with professional parents having a good life, you probably think, well, I'm going to have that. But the chances of having that with the divorce rate and whatever in Australia is very slim. So it's education and knowledge for me.
So Christine, what do you think some of the implications are of economic abuse? Larke's talked about in her situation, she just decided to walk away and just rebuild everything from scratch. I guess in your case, what were some of the implications? You talked about how you're still trying to sort of recoup your initial investments, and have there been other implications as a result of that situation?
Well, I suppose I was left with a lot of debt, obviously, and but Although, and I didn't know there were, I mean, I knew there were financial counsellors, but I didn't know there were family violence financial counsellors around. So I really didn't know I could go to a financial institution.
It probably wasn't when you...
There probably wasn't. It was 10
Probably
years
not,
ago.
no.
10 years ago. And yeah, so for me it was just, knuckle down and make a plan. Once I had a plan, I was all right, and I just sort of kept going with it. But it will mean that I don't think I'll ever retire, and it will mean that I don't know, like I didn't have those good holiday. I would have loved to have taken my children overseas, for example. That would have been a great thing to do. There were things I would have loved to have done with them that were just not on the cards. But so what? We all got out of that situation alive. We're all very healthy. We're all very close. I do have a lot of grandchildren, so I just absolutely love.
I think I'd trade
my
my
life
for the grandchildren.
And I do. I love my life, and I love the closeness of my children and my grandchildren. I think not once did they ever think what was going on was their fault. We used to sit and talk about what was going on. We wrote a diary from pretty much the time it started to the time he left, of everything that he did and when he did it and what he did. So, I mean, I think I wouldn't even remember half the stuff he had done if I hadn't had that written down, because you do tend to stop remembering these things if they're not great. So, yeah.
Your children may take you overseas.
Actually, I might talk to them about that. I've got a bucket list.
Donna, just picking up on what Christine said, what other implications are there? You mentioned homelessness earlier on, that is a potential impact.
Another thing where economic abuse, because it's the tool that can keep being used after the physical violence can stop. So you may flee a relationship, and so they may not be able to get to you physically. So we might use emotional, but economic abuse is a really big tool that can keep being used. So in regards to if there's joint debt, they might stop paying the debt, even though it might put them in a worse situation. Perpetrators sometimes think, well, I don't care what happens to me as long as it's worse for them. And this is it. So there's ways that the financial situation can keep getting worse even after you've left the relationship. So this can keep going on. And depending, you can get bad credit records, so you're not going to be able to get credit for many years because of the situation. So it can keep continuing for years and years and years after, even if you get out of that financial mess. And there are other things as well, because economic abuse isn't just debts. It could be that you haven't been allowed to socialise, you haven't been able to go out and get work, you haven't been able to go and study. So you may have no qualifications when you've come out of that relationship because you weren't allowed to. If English hasn't been your first language, you may have been socially, isolated. So again, trying to get a job, trying to get back on your feet is so much harder, and it's that economic abuse that can keep going.
Where would you suggest they go? I mean, you're a female financial
so
advisor.
When you say go, when you mean...
Meaning when you want some help or some advice. I mean, we were big at saying to women, you need to get a financial advisor that you feel comfortable with. It's no different to your hairdresser or your dentist or whatever. But I'm not talking about the violence side. Is there a place that
well,
they could go?
I guess you need to be able to talk to somebody you can trust, who you feel has got a financial thing. And that's sometimes hard when the abuse has taken the isolation. You may not have anybody, so it may come years and years down the track. So it may be, who do you approach then? And I guess it's what pathways you go down. There are community agencies, there are family violence workers, there are financial counsellors, there are, if English isn't your first language, there are agencies that deal with migrants. There are all sorts of places, but the problem is if you've been isolated, it's really hard for you to find them in the first place. So that's probably the first step. When somebody's left the relationship, who are they been able to talk to, and have those workers been looked at the whole picture and been able to put them onto the right pathways.
Is there any legal recourse in this area? As in, if you are a victim of financial abuse, is there any protection through the justice system, for example, that, whether it's being compensated or any criminal action?
So it depends on the type of abuse there has been. There is victims of crime assistance where there is monies available. If the debts have been incurred by a way that has been fraudulent by the other party, has the other party still got assets? Is it something you can pursue down the family law path? Or again, if there should have been something that a creditor could have sort of seen in the first place that would have revealed that there was economic abuse, they didn't ask the right questions, we may have recourse back on them to say that they haven't done the right thing. So these are things that can be looked at from the various points of law to see if there is any way that we can assist.
Christine, did you feel that there was enough support through the justice system when you were going through this in terms of being protected in that way?
Do you want me to be honest?
Absolutely.
There was absolutely no help in the justice system for recourse when I went through it. There was just nothing. The only thing you could really do was get a second job and work out how to pay it off. That was about it. To be able to get some justice, I would have had to take out an intervention order, which I could have done. I had the grounds to do it, but I think that would have been a very dangerous thing to do in the situation that I was in with him. And everything I did was to try and not bring peace to my house with the children, but in a way it was. But it was the path of least resistance, the path of least danger, the path of least having to worry about him turning up in the middle of the night to make good some of his threats. So, I just did what I had to do. You do need evidence to be able to get some recourse through the justice system, and if you're not prepared to go and get that evidence, then there is nothing. Yeah.
Larke, you worked in a financial institution for a while, and you talked about the literacy campaigns that you undertook, and I'm curious to sort of to know, in terms of financial institutions, what can they be thinking about in terms of how they think about women that are in these situations, in terms of whether someone's coming to apply for a loan, what are some of the checks that institutions can do to ensure that women are better protected? I mean, are these conversations...
Interestingly enough, when I think it's not an awful long time ago that a woman couldn't even get a loan from a bank unless her husband was her guarantor. So we're not talking, like Tiffany was born in the 80s, so it was in the early... Sorry, I'm thinking when this happened to me. In the early 80s, I remember when I left and I started working for Westpac, because prior to that we were managing hotels, but I went to apply for a loan to buy some furniture, and I said I'm separated, and they said, oh, well, we'll need your husband as a guarantor. So, I mean, there was a lot of issues for women that are, could never borrow any money unless there was a man involved. And same with, if you got married, you had to leave your job, and women didn't get super until not that long ago. So when we talk about these things, we're talking 20 years ago, we're not talking 60 years ago. So things have been really hard for women over the years. So when we think of our grandmothers and our great-grandmothers or our mothers, I mean, my mother thinks a man is a financial plan, because she's been married 4 times, so she just keeps going from one to the other. So she probably she's 91 now and she's got a boyfriend. So so the thing is, there are circumstances where women have not grown up in an environment where they've learned to think for themselves and understand these things. But it's changed a lot. So I think a lot of young women today are educating their kids better. But there's still a lot of issues. We did some research, and I don't know if you all heard this, where we were asking kids, do you get pocket money? And they talked about the boys' chores the boys did and the chores the girls did. And still the boys got paid more than the girls, because he mowed the lawn or he washed the car, but she did the ironing or packed the dishwasher. Whereas you've got the girls saying, if I would have known I got paid more, I would have mowed the lawn or I would have washed the car. So things have changed. The educational process and social media, I mean, while social media has been awful in a lot of cases, it's been really good as well, because women they really starve for knowledge. Women see having the information, sharing information as power. So we tell everybody about a good experience, or we recommend to our friends, go here, you know, get your hair done here, or shop here, or see this person because they help you. Whereas men see the having of that information as power. It's just different DNA. We think differently. So I think the big answer is people like Christine, I suppose, who you don't exactly want to talk about your circumstances to everybody, but if women were to hear these stories a lot more and understand what happens, that you look for those early signs, which you probably would say, well, I did look, but they came so quick, you know, they came so quickly. But I've talked to women who are getting married and going into a second marriage, and these women are in their 50s, 60s. And I've said, so have you had a discussion about your finances? And this friend of mine from Sydney said, oh God, no, I couldn't have that conversation because I think it'd just put a kibosh on the excitement and the romance of it. And then she rang me a week later and said, you know what, I thought about what you said, and we did have the conversation. And it started off a bit shaky because he did say to her, why are we having this conversation? And then once they sat down and talked about it, they got through it easily. So I still think people worry about, or women in particular, that their marriage or the relationship or whatever might go sour if they ask the wrong questions. Yeah.
Donna, what do you think? What do you think? The financial institutions and the justice system need to be thinking about in terms of women that are impacted by economic abuse?
I think we all need to understand what economic abuse is. It's been in the Family Violence Protection Act since 2008 with examples, but people still don't understand it, and I think that's across the board, that there's still a long way to go. The Royal Commission is making people start to take notice, and things are starting to happen. There is things happening in industry. A lot of industry are now doing family violence policy in regards to both their staff and how they deal with their customers. But it is at varying levels at this stage. It will vary quite considerably. I had a conversation with one of the creditors for a client the other day, and was saying, you know, she'd signed this as a victim of family violence and she should be taken off the contract. And his answer to that is she signed the contract without reading it. She's to blame. I said, do you have any understanding at all when you are dealing with family violence and you are signing, you're told by the perpetrator, sign the contract, and you're fearful of what will happen if you don't sign that contract? Are you going to take time to say, look, I've just got to read section 32 of it to make sure that, you know, there's not going to be any problem? You don't do it, you sign it. And there's still a lot of people out there that don't understand that financial abuse is a form of family violence, and it has long-term implications.
Can I say all of the banks, the big four at least, you can go to those banks, and there's departments now set up that if you do have those issues, they will absolutely sit down with you and work through them. So, but that wasn't always the case.
No.
It's only because there's a lot more published about it.
They all have hardship sections and things like that. The way they deal with them will still vary, and there's still the understanding of that this isn't something that can be fixed straight away. What institutions have problems with sometimes is, as financial counsellors, we go and look for hardship, we look for solutions on dealing with things. And creditors want timelines. They're going to say, how long is this going to take? Well, if anybody's been through the family law system, you're going to know that it isn't going to be fixed next week, especially if you're dealing with family violence, because what a perpetrator will do, as I said before, economic abuse is the gift that can keep on giving. And what they will do is they will extend things, or they won't hand in the documents in time, or it'll take longer. So trying to come up with, if you're looking at there's property and you want to do a property settlement which will deal with the debts, we could be talking years here. We're not talking 5 minutes. We can be talking a couple of years if we're lucky, depending on what the process is.
Is that why in some instances, like in Christine's example, someone will just walk away, just so that they're not put through that trauma?
It becomes too hard.
Yeah.
It becomes
it's
too
trauma
hard.
on trauma.
And people will use the justice system to try and prolong things. Yeah. And some people it's just too hard.
Yeah.
Your sanity makes you walk away from it too at the end of the day.
But it's
doesn't it?
part of recovery too. Like when I think 80% of women who are in family violence situations have got economic abuse in that, a lot of them won't know that it is, or they will know, but it's the least of their worries. So that makes me one of somewhere between 2 and 3 million women in this country who have been economically abused while being in a family violence relationship. That's a huge issue for this country. That is a huge problem. And for women, that double whammy of, that part-time, perhaps being the one that has the children, being the one maybe that stays home a little bit more, doing all that, already their financial building blocks aren't as firm in many ways as many men. And then you've got that on top of it. It's a huge problem and it's just going to get worse. And I was just thinking before, the financial abuse is a huge barrier to leaving a situation. Where do you go with 4 or 5 children? Like, what do you do and how do you do that? Especially if you have boys over the age of 12, 13 years who are not welcome in refuges for various reasons. What do you do with that? If you don't have family, like I was very, very isolated, no family between here and far north Queensland. And she's from far north Queensland. We had that conversation before, the FNQ group. And, what do you do when you're alone like that and when you've got all those children? It's a huge barrier to leaving and it's a huge barrier to recovery. Yep.
And I guess before I just open the floor to questions from the audience, in terms of thinking about, what we should take away from this in terms of thinking about our own finances. I mean, you've talked about that this does predominantly affect women, but men also are susceptible to it. What are some of the things that we should be thinking about when we enter relationships when it comes to finances to ensure that we at least limit, ending up in this situation? It's open to whoever wants to take it on.
I don't want to be a romance killer in this country, which I have to always say that up front. But my advice would be, if you're going into a relationship, a new relationship or whatever, you need to actually sit down and you don't have to be rich to have an agreement, a written agreement, and have somebody sit down and agree to these things before you get married or go into a relationship. And and I know we're talking new today, and if that person gets very upset and doesn't want to do it, well, then you don't go into the relationship. You make a hard call and you say, if we can't have this conversation and you can't tell me what your debt is and I'll tell you what mine is and what I'm not responsible for and my assets will go to my children while your assets can go to your children. You have these discussions, you get a lawyer involved and draw up a contract. You don't have to be rich to have those sort of contracts. If you can't do that, well, then you move on.
But you can do that with some of these men. You do that with some of these men. If they don't want, with perpetrators, if they don't want you to know what they're like, you will not know what they're like until you're in it. So I had those conversations. Those things were talked about. And
do you have anything on a contract, in a written agreement though?
No, I didn't have, but we are talking a fair while away.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So today
But we had those conversations. There were understandings. There was no way I knew what he was up to or into, and there's no way he would have let me know that. So it's great advice if you've got someone who's going to be honest and doesn't have this huge sense of entitlement or an addiction or whatever it is. That is good advice, and it's, of course you would try and do that, but I don't want women to think somehow it's my fault because I didn't have that conversation hard enough or fast enough, or like if someone wants to fool you, you won't know what they're like until you're in it. I mean, there may be signs, I don't know, but usually not.
I don't think there's a hard and fast answer. Yes, it's a good idea to have knowledge and know how debts work. It's not necessarily going to protect you, but understand how credit cards work, understand how debt works. If you get a credit card in a relationship and it says, I'll get a secondary card on the account, understand it's your responsibility. Now, that's not going to fix where there's abuse. It's really not going to fix it but at least you've got a better understanding. One thing I would suggest is if you're finally going to make the decision to leave get as much knowledge about the bank accounts and things that you can, and make sure you protect yourself, because one of the things that may happen when you leave a relationship, if there is money there, if it's all debt, well, there's nothing you can do. But if you've got a mortgage that's got a set-off account, how many times have I seen where a woman's left the relationship and the first thing the perpetrator has done is taken any money, any equity they could out of that mortgage. So if you can prepare yourself financially, get the knowledge to know where you can, you might restrict how much you end up in debt at the end.
I think superannuation's another thing. I think so many women today who stopped work and stay-at-home mums and their husbands continue to work and they've got the superannuation. You, being a financial advisor, when...
Counsellor, there's a difference.
Sorry.
I deal with people with debt.
Yeah.
I don't get to deal with people with money, so...
Yeah, okay, so if a financial advisor, when your husband is going for his, because they actually have meetings every quarter on how their financial situation is, their superannuation, their investments, you go along to them and you say, well, I'm a partnership in this. I'm staying at home to raise the kids. So I need to know what's in your partner's superannuation and he should know what's in yours if you're working. So if you've really got a good relationship, know what's there so that if the relationship does break down, there's a lot of money sometimes that you're entitled to out of his superannuation.
From the economic abuse point of view, that's actually another good tip though. If there's any mail anywhere that has things like superannuation, take note of who the superannuation is and things like that, because those sorts of information, if you do leave and then you are trying to do a family law case, will help you immensely. People don't think, oh, well, I think he got super, I'm saying he, sorry, the perpetrator got super. I don't know where it is, I've seen letters. If you get a chance, have a sneaky look and at least know that it's with X. It can help you immensely when you're trying to look at things, because when you're trying to get financial papers, when you're going through a family law thing, that is one thing that the other side might do, is try not to give you information.
There's a couple of guys in the room, which I'm sure you're feeling really intimidated here tonight, but there are a lot of men who go through the same situation. So I suppose this is a case for all of us to think carefully about all these things.
Indeed. I could ask you more questions, but at this point I think I'll open up to the audience. If anyone's got a question, I think there's an arm up right there.
I had to take some time writing it down to make sure that it was perfectly written for you. In the context of the political environment where human rights decisions are being put out to the public vote, where profit, patriarchy and privilege are reigning supreme, how do you bolster, educate and support our vulnerable populations who have the entrenched systems and policies that are pricing them out of upwards mobility and this possibility of bouncing back from the economic abuse that you're speaking of tonight?
Good question.
In the next 2 minutes.
Excellent question.
Donna?
It is an excellent question. Yeah, go.
I think somebody once said to me that human rights, it wasn't that long ago, is a game of patience. And I thought, well, with the gains we've made around family violence in the last, since the Royal Commission report came out and the things that are starting to happen, it has been a game of patience. Like I've been, working for 25 years in the field and we're finally seeing some things that might make a difference. So on the one hand, I think everyone who's an activist, everyone who has a social justice conscience, we just keep going at it and keep going at it and keep going at it. We will chip away, it will become a better world. I mean, I am an optimist with that. On the other hand, though, I was listening this morning to the debate driving in on 774. They were talking about the thing Malcolm Turnbull wants to do with 2 weeks, people being incarcerated for 2 weeks, and how awful this terrorist threat is, and we shouldn't have to, the privacy laws from the different states are getting in the way of terrorism and blah, blah, blah. And I was ringing up and trying to get on, of course, just sort of, our privacy laws get in the way all the time of perpetrators. More women are maimed and killed and injured, and what I see at the Alfred is disgusting at the hands of the people that are supposed to love them every single week in this country than we'll ever probably see in, terror attacks. But it's just one rule for the patriarchy and one rule for everybody else. So on the one hand, I'm optimistic. On the other hand, I spend a lot of time frustrated and screaming at the radio in the car. But I think you just have to keep chipping away at it. And when there's a good idea and there's the right time for it, put the pressure on and run with it.
I think social media will play a big part in all of this too, in the sense of what we talk about. I have to say, since I retired, I've actually become a real socialist. It's
Well
quite.
done, you.
And I would never have thought that'd come out of my mouth, but. Only because, I always strive for something and a brand name and I want this and I want that. And since I've retired, and it's not that I don't have enough money, but when is enough for people? You watch some of these obscene things where people on television are building a house that's worth $20 million for two people to live in it. And I think it's just got the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. That middle class is just disappearing. So, and it's getting worse. I think to a degree it's getting worse. So, and none of us are really in love with our politicians, are they? I mean, there isn't any party that you'd say is doing a fantastic job, but I would have to say that next time you're at the ballot, if you're going to vote, you really need to vote for somebody who's going to make a difference where this is concerned. Not that I want to sway you. The only thing I want you all to do is vote yes for same-sex marriage. Not that I want to be political.
Do we have any more questions? Yep, got a couple at the back.
Hi. So what I've heard this evening is a lot of reflection on individual responsibility, and that's great, but from a perspective of someone who has been a family violence survivor advocate for the last 10 years, with a background for the last 10 years of working at Centrelink and in superannuation, so having financial literacy, what I haven't heard much of tonight is about changing of structural and systemic responsibility around this, about corporations taking more responsibility around their lending practices so that vulnerable people potentially are going to be better protected at crisis stage from the beginning in the contract signing stage before everything turns to crap. Because even for myself, even having 10 years of being an advocate and knowing family violence inside and out, I found myself in a relationship ending after 6.5 years last year where I was left 50 grand in debt, and that person walked out, has paid not a cent on their half of the loan, and I'm struggling with that every single fortnight. I'm working 3 jobs and I'm becoming like Christine from a financial literate background and very aware of these things. What I would love to see is banks actually write these clauses into the loan documents from the beginning so that you have to have this discussion with the institution and with the person that you're getting into debt with from the beginning, like a prenup. What is your perspective on that?
That would be good in a perfect world. I'm not sure that we're going to see it. Unfortunately, we'd have to change more than just the banks. We'd probably have to change laws at this stage. Well, I'm not saying we can't, and it's not something that we shouldn't keep looking at, and we keep pushing. Financial counsellors are pushing all the time to show where the inadequacies are. The problem you've got with relationships sometimes is trying to work out what is just a bad loan and what is that the banks are responsible for and what is a relationship that's gone bad. Having said that, the understanding of loans, I think, needs to be improved, and probably the conversations need to go on more within a banking thing. People don't understand what jointly and severally means, and people think, okay, when we leave a relationship, we can both take half and we both deal with it that way. Unfortunately, jointly and severally means we'll go after whoever we can go after for the whole lot of money.
So, who's got the ability to pay it back, or who is
that,
paying
or,
it back?
or not even that in some cases. Like if one party can, they'll pursue it if they can find them. It'll be whoever it is that they can find that they will pursue. If there was any issue with the contract, I'd get somebody to look at it. They are starting to look at more. The ombudsman are starting to look at more in regards to fair contracts, in regards to family violence and whether or not there should be a separation. This is something that's just starting now, but we've still got a long way to go.
Have you had a conversation? I'm sorry, I was told not to put my hands up in face. Have you had a conversation with your bank about the fact that you're not the only one on the loan, and why aren't they asking your partner?
So The legal advice that I've had, and also from the bank, is essentially the options of I can default and they would pursue both parties, and that effectively for me would mean a bad credit rating. I'm not going to risk that. The other option is waiting 2 years past separation to pursue him under civil law, so where I'm no longer at risk of him pursuing my assets. Well, that's just gone out the window because he's leaving the country this week, and I'll have no way of pursuing him in a year's time. So I'm going to have to, for the remainder of the life of the loan, have this painful reminder of the financial abuse every single fortnight and have no way to get any justice. I want financial institutions to take more responsibility at contract stage.
Hear, hear.
Hear, hear.
Hi, I had a kind of similar question. So I know we've spoken a lot about personal responsibility and how the banks in the past, there have been problems with, you know, women not being able to get loans and that kind of thing. What are some tangible things that you think institutions could do to help women that find themselves in these situations other than education? Because as we know, women can be educated and still find themselves in these situations.
Well, I think where financial institutions are concerned, they see the educational bit as much as they could do. I mean, I know these circumstances, and we look at the banks and say, well, they're big, huge organisations making lots of profit, but a lot of times when you come in to borrow the money and you sit down and answer all the questions and you say that this is all a truth, and you're borrowing it together and everything, as I said, at the time when you're doing that, everything's wonderful and it's you know, you're feeling like nothing could ever go wrong, but what banks can do in the sense of other than give you the education, the knowledge, and I would have thought when you sit down, the banker who's signing you up for these documents, unless you use a broker or an in-between person, should be explaining all the circumstances to you. I think maybe what we need to be doing is saying to banks and other financial institutions who lend money, those kind of conversations when you're signing a contract should have a lot more knowledge imparted onto you as the borrower. I'm not sure, do you think?
Yeah, it's actually getting harder because nowadays you can get your loans online.
Yeah.
And then you sign them later, and it may not be somebody who goes through it all with you, but the responsibility is back on you to read clause number 927 and a half to make sure that you understand fully of what your consequences are. They do have a responsibility, and I don't know whether this helps anybody, but when they are giving a loan, whether it's to an individual or whether it's joint, that all parties to that debt get benefit from it. So for instance, if you're getting a loan and it's for, I'll name something that somebody told me the other day, they got a loan to help their partner pay for solicitor's fees from their previous relationship. Now, that is blatant. There is no benefit for that person to take out that loan, so they should not be on that loan. And there is an argument there that they shouldn't be on the loan. Now, they should be picking this up now.
Did they give that as the reason?
Well,
They were
the
borrowing
loan,
money?
yes. So I've gone through all that. Sometimes people don't put the right things on loans on what they want for. But in this case, it was clear what they wanted it for, and the bank is still arguing that this person should not be removed from the debt because they signed the contract. Well, that's not fair. That's not right, and that can be argued.
We probably have time for 2 more questions.
Hi, I just want to say thanks for coming out and speaking tonight. It's a topic very close to my heart. I want to ask about the 50% myth. It kind of scares me that I still hear people in conversations, even when I was coming out of a relationship, that, oh, but you're entitled to 50%. And it's an absolute myth because when I went through lawyers and everything else who ended up being useless, I was going to need 20 grand to go to the family court for him to answer a letter from my solicitor. It's all about what you bring in is what you're entitled to. And I was a married woman with no children, so I didn't have an asset, a human asset as such. What can we do about that? The other thing is, in reviewing the marital law, plebiscite aside, I had heard that in some countries, particularly Germany, that they don't allow divorce unless there's financial settlement first. Whereas in this country, you can almost divorce as soon as someone pays their $800 and signs the form after 12 months of separation. I think we need to look at that. And if it's so hard to get settlement, and you know, some of you talked about 20 years pursuing debt or paying off a debt when you've got children, then what can we do about that 2 years that we've got? Obviously, we need longer than 2 years to pursue financial settlement in some cases.
Yep.
Do you have comments on that?
Well, I don't think any of us are lawyers. Even though I work at Women's Legal Service, I'm a financial counsellor. Whether it's better to do the financial settlement first, because this can take a long time. Some people would prefer to be divorced. I guess it will depend on each individual circumstance. I'm not sure that that's going to change because it does suit some people. There is things being looked at, but I don't know how far it will get, that there needs to be something done in regards to small property pools. It's a huge issue where there's not hundreds of thousands in the property. There might be, you know, tens of thousands or things like that. And as you said, by the time you put it with a solicitor, that money's gone. So there's sort of noises, and women's have been looking at ways to try and lobby for what's sort of a tribunal for small property settlements. I think it would be something that would be really worthwhile. How successful it's going to be, I don't know.
And you would have to take into account, you know, any of those power issues if there was family violence in that situation too. You wouldn't want somebody having to wait around for a financial settlement to get away from somebody like that.
That's right.
Yeah.
Just one more very, very quick question.
Firstly, I'm a lawyer.
Oh, good. So you could answer that last question.
Well, I'll go back to the poor girl who spoke earlier about the gentleman, use that word loosely, leaving her. One avenue that you can consider, there's the Financial Ombudsman Service, and that's free of charge. And that can sometimes help you resolve a dispute with a lending institution if, in fact, it does require them to participate in that, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the lending institution is at fault. But the Financial Ombudsman Service, as I said, is free of charge, and that can sometimes be very helpful, and they will advocate on your behalf, and they deal with, in fact,
I need to say they will mediate. They won't advocate on your behalf. They don't take sides.
In the mediation,
but they will look at it. They won't work on sides.
No. They won't do your work for you. But when I say they'll advocate in the mediation or in the presentation of it, they will do that degree of work for you. So it's not like you need a lawyer. In respect of the family law side of things, I'm here to tell you that's the reality test that you need to think about before you young girls get into a relationship. Because with the increase in the number of divorces, it's a factory, and you are not going to get any justice in that system, because it's now almost what I personally call equivalent to e-tax. Because the longer you are in a relationship, the less the court wants to know about the particulars. And because, unfortunately, there aren't enough judges, there isn't enough staff, the emphasis is on getting you to settle your case and not have it clogging up the system. So if you've got an argument about liabilities that you shouldn't be responsible for in the division of the property, you're not going to get a hearing on it, and that's the reality of it. It'll be just, you should settle on the basis of it's 50-50, you'll be told.
If you're lucky.
Yeah, if you're lucky. But you will get to wear the responsibility of the debt, unfortunately, because no one's interested in your story when you get to the family court.
Yep. I will take that as a comment. Thank you very much. we could take more questions, but unfortunately we really are out of time. So I'd like you to join me in thanking our panellists, Donna Letchford, Christine Craik and Larke Riemer.
Thank you.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.